Senator David Pocock. He joins us live from Canberra. Senator, thanks so much for your time. You are in a unique position. You're in the Senate. I know you want more action on climate change, but you're also an elite athlete who benefited from sponsorship of companies. So where do you sit now? Where's the line?
I think the important thing to remember when we see athletes speak up is that most of these athletes grew up dreaming about playing sport at the highest level. The last thing they want to do is cause issues for their employer, open themselves up to all sorts of criticisms that we're hearing from sports lovers, from politicians. But athletes have real concerns. They live in our communities. They're seeing the effects of climate change. They live through the drought, the bushfires. We're seeing the floods. And we're saying fossil fuels are not the future. And what we're seeing with fossil fuels is that they are spending an absolute fraction of the record profits that they are reaping due to the war in Ukraine to prop up a social licence that is clearly dwindling. We know that we have to transition to renewables. No one's suggesting that we stop mining. And I think one of the things that we hear from politicians trying to do is saying, well, you're attacking the mining sector. No, people are saying fossil fuels are not the future. Clearly, mining is going to play an important role going forward. And indeed, we've seen some real leadership in the mining sector, electrifying their fleets, looking at options like green hydrogen on mine sites, but exploring for more fossil fuels, which most of these fossil fuel companies are doing, given what we know about climate change, is really irresponsible. And I think that's why we're seeing athletes say, enough is enough.
Sure.
Yeah, there's other sponsors out there. Fossil fuel sponsorship is actually a small fraction of the overall sports sponsorship in Australia.
Yeah, okay, it is a small fraction. And you say, fossil fuels aren't the future, but they are the reality right now. And they're going to be the reality for at least the next decade, at least the next 2 decades, probably 3. So, I mean, do you think it's slightly unfair that these fossil fuel companies are branded and they're still supporting some of these teams? They're making the transition. It might not be as fast as you or others like, but it's still happening. I mean, where's the line?
Well, a lot of these fossil fuel companies aren't transitioning. They're actually actively exploring for more coal, oil and gas, which is totally incompatible with a livable climate going forward. Even the International Energy Agency is saying no new fossil fuel projects.
Sure.
So, I think we've really got to look at what happened with tobacco, where as a society we decided this isn't good for people, and to allow them to continue to advertise, to try and continue to buy that social licence and affect children, it shouldn't be happening. So I think this is a really healthy debate for us to be having. Okay. And clearly we're seeing a lot of fear-mongering and saying it'll be the end of sport. But we heard all that
Senator,
with
let me
tobacco.
Put this example
is less
for
than
you.
5%
Hancock
of sponsorships.
Prospecting stepped in to save netball. Do you accept that without that, it may not have happened? Netball could have collapsed completely.
When it comes to that case, my understanding is that, and I obviously can't speak for the netballers, but what they're wanting is for Gina Rinehart to distance herself and apologise for Lang Hancock's horrendous language around poisoning waterways to deal with the Aboriginal problem. That seems pretty reasonable to me. If you're an athlete, you don't want to be associated with that sort of legacy, that sort of history of a company. So I've got a lot of respect for players that are willing to actually stick their neck out and say, I'm uncomfortable with this and I'd really like my sport to deal with it. These are important debates for us to be having. And when it comes to fossil fuels, First Nations communities across the country are being most affected by the extraction of fossil fuels. And then in terms of climate change, are the first and the hardest hit. So we've got to be listening and we've got to be making these changes.
Let me ask you this, David, because, Senator, because you've been really great in the past, I've got to say, with interviews and you're really upfront. You say, well, if you don't have the answer, I don't know, I'll look into it. Do you know, as we sit here today having this debate, what do you think is an acceptable company or industry that is now able to sponsor a team? Because alcohol, tobacco's out, gambling's out, fossil fuels is out. I'm struggling to see what company can now afford to sponsor some of these big teams on a multi-million-dollar level and still have that acceptable social licence.
Well, I don't think most of those aren't out. You turn on the TV and you see gambling companies, alcohol companies, lots of fossil fuel companies sponsoring. So they're not out, but as a society, I think we're starting to realise the impact that fossil fuel burning is having. And we're saying we've got to get serious about this transition. And we've got a bunch of companies that don't have credible transition plans. They're actively exploring for more coal, oil and gas. And people have concerns about that. We all share this incredible continent and we're seeing the impacts of climate change. So those, that list of companies, they're not out. They're still actively sponsoring sport. What I'm saying is we should be able to have this debate. And it's really important that we're actually listening to the concerns of sports fans and of athletes. And it's up to each individual club and each individual sport to actually decide, does this square with our values? And fans and players are an important part of that.
David, Senator Pocock, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.